Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Charlene, and I am the Program Manager for Conservation at the Weston Family Foundation. It's my pleasure to be with you here today to share some of our recommendations and guidelines as it relates to the application process for the second phase of the Weston Family Prairie Grasslands Initiative. Before we get started, I do want to take a moment to run through some general instructions for today's webinar. To help ensure that all this runs smoothly, we ask that you please mute your microphone throughout the call to minimize background noise and disruptions, and submit any program-related questions via the chat, which will remain open throughout this presentation. If you happen to have any Teams or IT-related issues during the webinar, you can connect with my colleague, Erin Kiyanaga, who's here on the call and in the chat, and she will do her best to support you and ensure that you're able to fully participate in this virtual setting. We have 5 items on the agenda for today's webinar, including an overview of the Weston Family Foundation, background on the origin and first phase of the Prairie Grasslands Initiative, details of our grant call, and an overview of the associated application process. This presentation component will take approximately 20 to 25 minutes, with the remaining time dedicated to answering your questions about the program. So as mentioned, we'll be accepting questions via the chat throughout the presentation, and I really encourage you to feel free to post there as and when things come to mind, understanding that I'll address all of your questions at the end of the presentation. To begin, I'd like to start by sharing a little bit about the foundation, who we are and what we do, particularly for those of you who may be less familiar with our work. So the Weston Family Foundation is the private philanthropic foundation of the Weston family, who for over 60 years have been invested in supporting innovation and learning for the betterment of all Canadians. The foundation takes a collaborative approach to philanthropy by working alongside forward-thinking partners such as yourselves to advance Canada and create lasting benefit for us all. Recognizing the critical relationship between healthy people and healthy landscapes, the Foundation has championed world-class health research and innovation with the same passion that it supports the protection of Canada's vast and biodiverse landscapes. This is best represented in our 2 pillars of healthy aging and healthy ecosystems, which guide our strategic development and funding programs. Our Healthy Ecosystems pillar focuses on restoring and protecting biodiversity by funding applied research, protecting ecosystems, and connecting Canadians to nature through our environmental stewardship and Northern and Science research programs. The Weston Family Prairie Grasslands Initiative falls under the Foundation's environmental stewardship programming, which was predominantly centered on the managed, more densely populated landscapes located in what we call southern Canada, or the area between the US-Canada border and the Boreal Line. Our environmental stewardship programs seek to improve, restore, and protect the biodiversity of Canada's wild, agricultural, and urban landscapes by supporting land managers in gaining access to the information, tools, and resources they need to be good stewards of the land. We currently operate a range of programs, including our soil health and meadowway initiatives, as well as the Weston Family Prairie Grasslands Initiative, which delivered its first phase of funding between 2021 and 2024. So with the goal of restoring and protecting biodiversity in Canadian landscapes, the Foundation's Conservation Committee sought to identify and characterize the predominant needs and challenges that were affecting biodiversity in Canada. In evaluating the that aligned with our healthy ecosystems goal, it immediately became clear that Canada's prairie grasslands offered a unique and important opportunity through which the Foundation could play a role in protecting biodiversity, where the prairies contribute so significantly to Canada's biodiversity at a landscape level. As you all undoubtedly know, grasslands support the survival of diverse plant and wildlife species. They provide critical habitat for soil microbial life and offer a wide range of ecosystem services central to the lives and livelihoods of the diverse communities who live and work on the land. Importantly, the prairie grasslands also play a critical role in landscape connectivity at a continental level by linking the northern grassland habitat to the larger North American central grasslands biome. Despite their incredible ecological value and the fact that they are in many ways integral to the biodiversity of Canada, grasslands remain one of the world's most endangered and underprotected ecosystems, and further reflect a critical gap in Canada's current funding landscape. So although over 115 million acres have been lost to date, there are still large tracts of grasslands that remain intact, leaving us with an immediate and critical opportunity to have meaningful biodiversity impact at a landscape scale. With this need and opportunity in mind, the Foundation saw its own opportunity to build on the success of the first 5 years of the Grasslands Initiative by applying our learnings and insights toward developing a new program that continues to support the protection of biodiversity while simultaneously addressing new and emerging needs affecting grassland stewards today. The resulting 2025 Weston Family Prairie Grasslands Initiative launched last week on February 18th with the goal of protecting the long-term ecological integrity and biodiversity of Canada's prairie grasslands. The program constitutes a 5-year, $30 million funding opportunity spanning 2025 through 2030 that's structured as an open call for scalable, systems-based collaborative projects spanning 3 to 5 years in length. Between now and April 1st, the Foundation will be accepting letters of intent for projects that seek to protect grasslands biodiversity through one or more of our 3 priority conservation approaches that are stewardship, economic viability, and training. Before I speak to the specifics of the program, I do want to highlight that there is a full program detail document available on the Weston Family Foundation website that includes all the information that I'm about to share as it relates to the grant call. The purpose of today's webinar is to really highlight the most important pieces of information from that document and speak to some of the nuances that are perhaps a little bit more specific to the Foundation and how we operate to help you understand how best to design and build your projects as it relates to this funding. So as I'm speaking through all of these details, please note that you don't have to write them down. They are available to you in written form, which you can use as a reference throughout the application process moving forward. And with that said, I thought the simplest way to outline the program would be to address the who, what, when, where, and why of it all. Starting with the who, which in this case refers to our applicant eligibility. In order to be considered eligible for this initiative, applicants must be based in Canada with operations in the prairie grasslands. Specifically, we're looking to work with partners who have boots on the ground and are actively engaged in the grasslands in such a way that allows for them to effect meaningful and lasting change. Part of the application will ask you to describe your organization and demonstrate how it is uniquely qualified to contribute toward the initiative. So here I'd suggest thinking about and demonstrating how your organization can or will operate at a landscape level in order to protect biodiversity. Further to having operations in the grasslands, applicants must demonstrate the ability to support the program goals and objectives in alignment with the strategic approach, which I'll outline shortly. And finally, applicants must be qualified donees in accordance with the Canada Revenue Agency and Income Tax Act. Qualified donees, as defined by the Canada Revenue Agency, may include registered charities, Canadian municipalities, municipal or public bodies performing a function of government, or the Government of Canada, its provinces and territories. If you are unsure as to whether your organization is a qualified donee, I'd recommend reviewing the CRA guidances on qualified donees, which are available on the CRA website. If you are not a qualified donee, but believe that your organization and proposed project meet all other criteria of the grant call, I ask that you please contact me directly to set up a meeting to discuss your project and identify whether there may be opportunities through which we could support your work moving forward. The next thing I'd like to do is speak a little bit more to what it is that we're looking to achieve, which is best captured in the program's strategic principles, objectives, and approaches. We have 4 strategic principles that apply to all environmental stewardship programming, whether it be related to the grasslands or otherwise. These principles reflect the key features of what we at the Foundation consider to be a well-designed project with the greatest potential to succeed at a landscape level. And so when working to build your projects, I'd recommend keeping these principles front of mind and ensuring as much as possible that you're thinking about scalability, systems-based approaches, collaboration, and measurable impact when developing your program design. In addition to our 4 principles, we're looking for projects that address new and emerging needs underlying conservation in the grasslands, specifically those that protect biodiversity through one or more of our priority conservation approaches. For this second phase of the Weston Family Prairie Grasslands Initiative, priority conservation approaches include stewardship, economic viability, and training. Projects must apply at least one of these approaches in order to be considered eligible for funding. Although I do want to stress that you are by no means required to include more than one approach in your project, as there's no preferential scoring associated with using 2 approaches or 3 approaches as compared to just using 1. So I would suggest that rather than trying to shoehorn everything into one project, that you focus on the priority conservation approaches that are most aligned with your knowledge base, skill set, and expertise, and identify a focused, cohesive, and refined concept instead of something that's trying to do a little bit of everything. To help you get a better sense of what it is we're looking for as it relates to these approaches, I'll speak to each of them in a little bit more detail, starting with stewardship. So, stewardship projects include those that promote the increased adoption and use of best stewardship practices across the range of practitioners operating in the prairies. Examples of stewardship projects include those that incentivize the increased use, of management approaches such as wildlife-friendly fencing, rotational grazing, and prescribed fire, or activities such as water development and species at risk management. Economic viability projects include those that address the economic drivers affecting land use change, with the goal of reducing conversion and protecting the ecological integrity of grasslands. Essentially, this approach seeks to close the gap between crop production and grass-based systems by supporting projects that deliver a range of tools like market-based incentives, insurance, lending, and agricultural mentorship that together they can be used to build a value proposition for the grasslands themselves. So this approach of economic viability is a little bit new, even to us at the foundation. And while we do have some ideas as to what these projects might entail, we are looking forward to seeing what you, our knowledge experts, bring forward to address this critical need, both in the short and the long term. Finally, training projects include those that deliver evidence-based knowledge, tools, and resources to support ecologically based land management amongst practitioners living and working in the prairies. Examples of training projects include those that deliver peer-to-peer training, practical workshops, or on-the-ground demonstrations. So as you start to think about these priority conservation approaches, I feel it's important to keep in mind that all projects, whether stewardship, economic viability, or training-based, must be implemented in grassland-dominated habitats within the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and/or Manitoba. Again, we don't expect to require projects to operate across this entire range, but strongly recommend that you be very specific and clear in identifying your geographic scope, as projects operating outside this designated range will not be considered eligible for funding at this time. Although we have deliberately opted to be quite focused in our geographic scope, we are eager to welcome applications from the full range of stewards operating in the grasslands, including projects that are Indigenous-led and are meaningfully partnered with Indigenous organizations working at a landscape level. So recognizing the critical role that all land stewards play in protection of grasslands biodiversity, I'd like to reiterate the importance of systems-based and collaborative approaches that embrace the inherent complexity of the landscape and work to develop cohesive, unified, and inclusive mechanisms for conservation, as these are highly valued both for the purposes of this program as well as across the foundation as a whole. Finally, I'd like to share a little bit more of the why that's really driving this initiative from the Foundation's perspective. I've already highlighted our core goal, which is to protect the ecological integrity and biodiversity of Canada's prairie grasslands using our three conservation approaches of stewardship, economic viability, and training. But beyond the impact we hope to see through support of your projects, we further set ourselves a few goals that we hope to achieve, such as advancing applied knowledge, improving access to technical training, providing opportunities for collaboration, motivating adoption of best practices, and mobilizing knowledge and key learnings that are derived through this program's work. While these outcomes and impacts are perhaps a little bit peripheral to the design and development of your projects at the moment, I think it's useful for you to get a sense of what motivates us as funders in order to inform your contributions to the larger application process. Okay, so having spoken to the various details of the program, I'm going to take some time now to outline the specifics of our application process. The Foundation's application process is delivered in two phases, beginning with the Letter of Intent, or LOI, which is a brief document outlining the high-level project concept, anticipated funding request, and key partnerships being proposed for funding consideration. These LOIs should capture your blue sky list of activities and clearly demonstrate what it is you intend to achieve as it relates to the program goals and objectives. Following the LOI phase, select applicants who've passed the preliminary internal review will be invited to participate in the proposal stage, which includes the development and delivery of more detailed materials, including things like project timelines, budgets, and letters of support. Proposals will be reviewed and adjudicated by a panel of independent external advisors representing the range of knowledge and expertise found throughout Canada's prairie grasslands. And you can find more information about the review process on page 8 of the program details, which are available on the Weston Family Foundation website. The foundation will be accepting LOIs between now and Tuesday, April 1st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Any applications received after this deadline will not be included for funding consideration. LOI applications must use the template that's been provided and follow all instructions outlined at the start of that document. These include the document page limit, format requirements, and guidelines for submission. So we ask that you please ensure when developing your LOI that it's fully complete and that it meets all of these requirements that I've referenced just now prior to submission. You can access a copy of the LOI template on the Weston Family Foundation website by navigating to the grant call page and scrolling all the way to the bottom, where you will find a list of hyperlinked relevant documents, the last of which is the LOI template. If you select the LOI template, it'll open in your browser as a Word document, which you can download by selecting the ellipsis at the top right-hand corner and clicking download. And if you happen to have any difficulties accessing that template, please don't hesitate to connect with us via email, and we'll make sure to follow up with you and get that document to you so that you're able to use it and fill it out accordingly. One other thing that I'd like to note as it relates to the LOI is the funding request, which you'll see captured at the start of the document, as well as in question 8, which focuses on budget. Here we're looking to understand what the total funding request to the foundation will be for your project. And unlike some other applications, we're deliberately not specifying a minimum, maximum, or average grant value. Accordingly, I encourage you to be clear, not only in telling us what it is that you aim to do, but importantly, what level of funding will be required in order for you to do so. And having come from the research space myself, I've been in the position of trying to shoehorn my projects into fitting a maximum or minimum dollar amount. And so rather than prescribing you a set value, we at the foundation are really happy to be able to request budgets that are comprehensive, reasonable, appropriate, and representative of your project activities. You can find this information as well as more information about our funding specifications, including things like overhead and partial funding, on page 7 of the program details. Overall, we're going to be asking that you submit up to 1 LOI on behalf of your organization. That said, where we strongly encourage organizations to seek collaboration, we're happy for individual organizations to participate as secondary collaborators on more than one application. Note that all LOIs must be submitted as a single PDF document via email to the Weston Family Foundation's conservation team, who can be reached at our share email address, which will be listed in the LOI as well as at the end of this presentation. Finally, when submitting your LOI, please look out for an email confirming our receipt of your LOI. If you don't receive a confirmation within 2 to 3 business days, I recommend sending us a quick email to confirm that we've got it and ensure that your application hasn't been missed or overlooked in our email inbox. Finally, this is the working timeline, and it can be used to get a general sense of our anticipated program delivery over the next few months. Note that these dates and times are subject to change and that the foundation will make every effort to keep you informed of our timeline over our social media channels. But as I've mentioned, we will be accepting applications between now and the LOI deadline on April 1st. In that time, we'll be hosting one additional informational webinar, which will take place on Thursday, March 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The second webinar will feature the exact same content, resources, and information that I'm outlining today. So I suggest if you're here, don't worry about attending the next session, as it'll be very similar, if not exactly the same, to what it is that I'm delivering today. For your information, we wanted to let you know that we expect to distribute our call for proposals in late spring of this year, with an anticipated proposal submission deadline of Monday, June 30th. And finally, we plan to have our funding decisions made by this fall, with the first round of payments to be delivered by the end of the 2025 calendar year. Before I move to address your questions, I do just want to leave you with a few recommendations to help guide and inform the LOI process. Firstly, at the Foundation, we very much see the application process, both at the LOI and proposal stage, as being interactive. So please don't hesitate to connect with us at any time, as we're more than happy to help where we can. I've already spoken to the importance of collaboration, but want to encourage you again to consider opportunities to co-produce projects in collaboration with other grassland stewards. Finally, I recommend that when developing your projects, you really challenge yourself to think long term and consider how your work might scale, expand, or grow over time, where projects demonstrating the ability to deliver those impacts may be considered for funding beyond 2030. And with that, I'll move toward addressing your questions as best as I can. But before I do so, I just want to run through some quick guidelines for our question and answer period in order to help ensure that it runs as smoothly as possible. So please ensure that your questions pertain to the program details or the program in general, rather than your specific projects. I'd be happy to talk to you about your projects on a one-to-one basis, and you can feel free to reach out to us at our shared email, and we'll be happy to schedule a call accordingly. You can submit your program-related questions via the Teams chat. And if you are, for whatever reason, unable to submit a question through the chat, please use the raise your hand function, and we'll call on you to unmute and share your question via the microphone. Finally, here's our contact information, which you're welcome to use at any time to connect with us as it relates to the program details, your project, or any questions that might come up throughout the application process. And with that, I'm just going to change my view and see if we have any questions coming in via the chat. Okay. Fantastic. So we had a question about contact information, and Erin kindly answered. A question from Ross was, the economic viability option leads to some exciting opportunities. It's wonderful to see. Okay, so just some great feedback. Thank you, Ross. Okay, so a question from Graham. You mentioned AMP grazing. Are you separating native species grasslands from that of tame, introduced forage species, private grass only? So no, we aren't making a distinction between native species grasslands or those that are tame grasslands. Both are considered eligible for funding under our stewardship, economic viability, and training. And I hope that answers your question, but feel free to post a clarification if there's anything further. Amanda asked, are matching funds required? If so, what is the match ratio? We don't require any matching funds or leveraging in order to consider projects for funding. And so we have in the past funded projects in their entirety. We have in the past funded projects partially, but we don't require any kind of match in order to consider your project or fund the project. A question from Ross was, if the project is too large, will the foundation engage in further discussions to scale back if the proposal provides a good fit for the deliverables? Absolutely. So like I said, scalability is a big part of our funding consideration and something that we really look for in successful projects. As you know, we had the 2020 to 2024 Grasslands program. We're back for a second iteration, and we hope to stay and continue to support the grasslands in the long term. And so if a project is quite large, we're happy to work with you and your organization in order to figure out a phased structure where perhaps in this iteration of the Grasslands program funding, we can address the first phase and think about how we might be able to continue to support that work in the long term. And that's a great question. Thank you, Ross. Can projects include activities that support restoration as well? And that's a question from Melissa. So although restoration isn't a priority or isn't one of our key conservation approaches as identified in this iteration of the Grasslands program, we certainly recognize the value and importance of them. And so while we are sort of honing in on trying to focus in on other aspects of conservation, we're interested to see and have restoration be included, but it perhaps won't be as well aligned with our current strategic objectives as things like stewardship, economic viability, and training. So Graham's asking, what's the definition of economically viable? And again, it is a little bit of a tricky thing to define. And like I said, it's something that's new to us and something that we're really looking to explore through this application process. We've defined economic viability as things that address sort of the gap between crop production and grass-based systems and looking to fill that space in order to create a value proposition for grasslands, staying as grasslands in the long term. I identified a few examples of what those projects might look like, but really do think that there is a lot of opportunity to talk about it and discuss and think about creative ways that we might be able to support the grasslands from an economic perspective, and really think about how we can address those economic drivers of land use change. So hopefully that speaks a little bit to what it is that you're looking to clarify there. A question from Colton. Could you go a little bit more into detail on what would be considered results-based quantitative programming? Would ecological outcome verification programs count? That's a really great question, Colton, and something that I think perhaps might require a little bit more discussion to get a better sense of what you mean by an ecological outcome verification program. And so I would encourage you to reach out to us at conservation@westonfoundation.ca, and we'll be happy to either respond to you via email in greater detail or schedule a call where we can have a quick chat about it and see if that's something that would be eligible under the current funding program. Are collaborations expected to be only with other land management organizations? Would this collaboration also apply to educational institutes such as universities? Yes, so we are interested in engaging the full range of stewards operating in that space. That does include academia and universities. And so partnerships with universities would be suitable with respect to collaboration, although we'd be interested to see what types of work you're bringing forward through that collaboration. Are youth education's initiatives based in grasslands, knowledge sharing, considered as training? They could be. I think a really big part of both training and economic viability is this idea of succession as it relates to the grasslands, and getting people interested and engaged in training. We would need to learn a little bit more about your program specifically and who you're looking to train and what types of training you're looking to provide. And so that's another example of a question where I really invite you to reach out to us by email, and we can either correspond over email or coordinate a call to talk about it in greater detail. I apologize, everyone. We're getting more questions and it's moving, so it might take me a moment just to figure out where I'm at. Okay, so that was a question from Catherine. Catherine, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll make sure to get back to you. The next question is from Kate. What is the length of time that will be provided to complete a full proposal if requested? That's a great question. So we anticipate sending out our call for proposals late spring. I believe it's 6 to 8 weeks that we're hoping to offer for the development of proposals. But again, those dates are tentative and subject to change according to our evaluation process and how that starts. But regardless of when we distribute that call for proposals, there will be a minimum of 6 weeks for proposals to be developed. A question from Tamara. Could you please give us some examples of what types of programs would be funded or ones that would not be funded? Would program development be eligible for funding? It's an interesting question. I'd be interested to learn more about what you mean there. For example, in the first iteration of the Prairie Grasslands initiative, which ran from 2020 to 2024, we did fund the creation of an entirely new program, which some of you may be familiar with. It's the Canadian Prescribed Fire Exchange. So that is an example of a program that was developed and launched entirely through the Prairie Grasslands initiative. So there is an opportunity for us to support programs that already exist and are established on the landscape, or new programs that could potentially be developed with the support of this funding. And I hope that answers your question, Tamara, but please feel free to let me know if you have any clarifying questions or if there's any other information that I could provide. A question from Kara is, could you provide some examples of projects you funded in the last 5 years? That's a great question. And if you look at if you go to the Weston Family Foundation website, under environmental stewardship, you'll find a page outlining the first iteration of the Prairie Grasslands initiative, which includes the list of grantees that were funded under that initiative and links to their projects. And I think that might be the best way to get a sense of the work that was covered in the first phase of the initiative, where our grantees have done such an excellent job in communicating and conveying the work that they've done. So I direct you there. And if you have any other questions or are looking for some more information about some of the specifics, feel free to reach out to us and we'll make sure to follow up with you accordingly. Fantastic. Here's a question from Erin. What kinds of projects are eligible under the economic viability stream? Would exploring potential payment for ecosystem services on prairie grasslands be eligible under this stream? That's a great question that we actually received prior to the webinar, and I would say maybe and possibly yes. I do think exploring payment for ecosystem services is something that could fall under the economic viability conservation approach. And it would encourage you, if you are interested in addressing that particular conservation approach and have some ideas that you're perhaps unsure about whether they would qualify, to reach out to us directly, and we can address those on a case-by-case basis to make sure that we are aligned and we understand what it is that you're doing before you invest that time and energy in developing the LOI. Another question that came through ahead of the webinar was, will projects helping to recover populations of species at risk using ex situ rearing be considered? And again, that's a great example of a question where I think we benefit from a little bit of discussion, a little bit of opportunity to understand more of your project scope and potential. We are certainly interested in supporting species at risk, particularly through our stewardship conservation approach, where the protection and management of species at risk at a landscape level is considered a best stewardship practice. And so, yeah, if you have specific questions related to your project similar to those, I'd recommend reaching out to us and we'll be able to speak with you directly and help clarify. A question from Jane. So what about restoring an area with grasslands not showcased in other restoration areas with the specific intent to train agricultural students and the public? So I think what that means is, what about training that's focused on restoration? I think if you make a case for that being training that is going to contribute toward preserving and protecting the biodiversity of grasslands as a whole, that could work very well as a training program. And so, like I said, we really do value and recognize the importance of restoration. And by no means do we want to sort of belittle or underrepresent the value of that conservation approach. It was really just in the interest of focusing and really directing our attention towards these 3 conservation approaches that we've tried to move forward with: stewardship, economic viability, and training, that we've had to move away from some others. But I think what you're describing there, Jane, could work really well as a training program. And again, would encourage you to just connect with us and we can chat about it and get a better sense of what you're thinking about and whether it's aligned with our program strategy and objectives. Another question that came in before, which I feel like I spoke to a little bit during the presentation, was how much funding per project? What's the cost share percentage? Like I said, we are really happy to hear what it is that your projects are going to cost. And so rather than prescribing a maximum, minimum, or average value, we want to know what it is that you're able to do and how much that realistically is going to cost. Yeah, and so there's no sort of specifics or prescribed amounts around that. But if you have any questions, or I guess if you're thinking about it, you can think about the entire program as a $30 million program going out over 5 years. That's roughly about $6 million a year. And so you can kind of gauge within that respect how much funding might be available year to year in order to support your project. A question from Tala. A question around who can apply. Are research institutes that are based outside the prairies eligible to apply if they are conducting research that is based in the prairies. In order to be eligible, would we need to partner with organizations or groups that are based in the prairies? That's a really great question. So the eligibility requirement is to ensure that we are working with partners who have operations on the land. And so your offices or your institute don't have to be based in the geographic region that is outlined in our scope. But you are correct. We would request that you be conducting research that is based in that area. Um, and if not, we could, meet with you and meet with some other applicants to see if there are opportunities to connect you with people working in those spaces, in order to ensure that you have the tools and resources to implement your work. But I think to answer your question, it would be, no, you don't have to be based there, but you do have to have operations that are land-based and operating on the lands in the prairie grasslands. Question from John, would you support a standalone outreach and awareness program, or should this be embedded in another project? So outreach and awareness, although incredibly important to supporting the protection of grasslands, isn't as much aligned with our identified conservation approaches. And so I would say that in this case, that might be something that could provide a lot of value if embedded within the context of a larger program that more directly addresses the conservation approaches, objectives, and goals that we've outlined today, as well as in the program detail. But that's a great question. Thanks, John. Ian asked, do you anticipate another Prairie Grasslands Initiative call in 2030? That's a really great question. And while I can't speak to the exact name or whether it's going to go out as a Prairie Grasslands Initiative, you know, I do feel comfortable saying that we are in the grassland space and foresee that we will be here in the extended term. And so the answer to your question, Ian, is yes, we do foresee continued funding beyond 2030 in the grassland space. But similar to the changes that we've seen from the first iteration of the prairie grasslands between 2020 and 2024, and the one that we're talking about today, it may evolve and change to address emerging needs and interests. But it'll certainly, or the goal and the hope is that we will certainly continue to be in this space in the long term. A question from Cara was the Nose Creek Preservation Society might be interested in partnering. Oh, okay. So that was just a comment. Thank you, Cara. And Tamara, would land securement be eligible for funding? So if by land securement you're referring to permanent protection, easements, and things like that, those are perhaps less aligned with our current program strategy. And again, it's one of those things that we explored in the first phase of the Prairie Grasslands Initiative. We had a few grantees doing land securement, land protection, permanent protection, and found it to be really, really successful. But almost something that we're looking to see how it goes, I think I should say. So having seen the impact achieved through land securement in the first phase, we're shifting our focus to some other things to kind of explore and build out in this current phase and give a little bit of time to those land securement projects in order to see how they go before coming back to them and seeing if there's something that we can do in that space in the long term. Okay, so this is another question that Erin is sharing on behalf of one of our participants who submitted this question before the call. Will there be any future plans to fund creation or restoration of native tallgrass prairies in southern Ontario? These ecosystems are incredibly rare and provide habitat for numerous at-risk species as well as other environmental benefits. They are an important component of our natural and cultural heritage. That is absolutely true and something that I appreciate you sharing. Unfortunately, Ontario is outside the geographical scope for this funding and will likely be outside the scope for our funding as it relates to the Prairie Grasslands Initiative in the long term. When developing this initiative, the foundation spent a lot of time thinking how we could best have impact at a landscape level, and accordingly decided to focus on the grasslands located in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And so, although we recognize the incredible importance of grasslands that are located outside of those provinces, um, unfortunately, they aren't eligible for funding at this time through this particular initiative. Okay, and another question that came in before the webinar was with regard to being a native plant nursery located in the grasslands region that supplies plant material and native seed for grasslands restoration projects. And the participant was wondering if we have any capacity to support restoration and whether that's included in this scope. And as I mentioned before, restoration is a little bit outside the scope of the current initiative. And so although we recognize the importance and value of restoration, it's something that we aren't immediately focusing on as it relates to our current program strategy, goals, and objectives. It's a great question, Kaya. So Kaya asked, does your funding support conservation projects in small urban prairie grasslands, or is it primarily focused on large-scale grassland areas? I would say to date, we've focused primarily on large-scale grassland areas, but that's not to say that if located within the geographical scope and aligned with our larger program objectives, that we wouldn't entertain projects seeking to support grasslands in small urban centers. And so I'd be really interested to learn more about what it is that you're referring to, Kaya. And yeah, if you're happy to, feel free to reach out to us and we'd love to sort of schedule a chat, learn a little bit more, and figure out if that is aligned with our program at the moment. We have another question from Tala. And she asks, under the economic viability stream, are general research projects looking at how to enable uptake of market mechanisms eligible, or do projects have to be more practical and go beyond research into public engagement and pilot projects that are actually implementing market-based mechanisms? That's a really great question. And I would say perhaps the latter. So again, we really do value the role of research in terms of supporting knowledge generation and providing stewards with the tools and resources they need in order to be good stewards of the land. A focus of this initiative, however, is sort of that practical element to take knowledge that's been generated and apply it within the public space. And so with respect to your question, I would say we really are looking for that latter piece, specifically projects that have a more practical approach and go beyond research into the public engagement and pilot phase. But that's a really great question, and thank you very much for asking that. Grassland only land, so no. For grasslands, we're referring to the ecological zone, but it's not exclusively lands that have never been farmed. They can be managed grasslands, tame grasslands. All of those are eligible for funding under this initiative. And that was a question from Kara, and I hope that answers your question. Fantastic. That's a really great way to know. Yeah, thank you, Kara. Okay. Well, we've got about 15 minutes left on the call. But if there aren't any more questions, or if there aren't any questions at the moment, I'm happy to give you all back 15 minutes of your day. We'll hold on for a minute or so just to see if anything else comes in. But if not, thank you so much for your time. The webinar will be posted online, Jonathan. That's a really great question. We are recording this, and it should be posted within the next few days on the Weston Family Foundation website alongside the grant call. Okay. Well, with that, I do want to say, oh, here we go. One more question. Tamara asked, where were the list of past projects? Again, please, and thank you for answering our question. So more than welcome. You can find the list of past projects on the Weston Family Foundation website. And I'm actually going to give us one more moment because I think my colleague Erin here is going to find us a link, if possible.
Yeah, I'll pull through it.
Fantastic. So Erin's going to throw a link in the chat for you tomorrow, and then that way you'll have direct access to those programs. But to everybody else, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. I really appreciate your interest. in this program. And like I said, please don't hesitate to contact us, as we're more than happy to chat with you and look forward to seeing what opportunities and ideas you bring forward as it relates to the Prairie Grasslands Initiative. I'm just going to hold for one more minute for that link. But thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day. There it is. All right. I'll give everybody a minute to grab that link if they need it. Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for your time. We're going to be signing off for the day, and hope you have a wonderful day as well. Thanks, everyone.